everybody, and welcome to Philosophy Today, your weekly podcast that connects philosophers and their ideas with contemporary themes. I'm your host, Lydia Jach, and today's podcast will be all about Kant and Covid. In the last episode, we talked about rationalism versus empiricism, and this theme will be picked up in today's discussion as well, since we're talking about a philosopher who bridged these two approaches of knowledge attainment, Immanuel Kant. Someone pointed out an article to me the other day called Coronavirus, what philosopher Immanuel Kant can teach us about panic buying and isolation dodging by The Conversation. And it really got me thinking about a connection of Kant's ideas and the ongoing pandemic. I've got three very special conversation partners tuning in with me for this episode. They're called Aaron, Mai, and Alina, and they are three fellow students of mine who studied Kant and his philosophy and science as part of a course for our bachelor's in communication science. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. We're so happy to be here today.
So we're talking about a real-world problem today, meaning it literally concerned the whole globe, the COVID-19 pandemic. However, to remain some focus, I decided to base this episode around the COVID situation in the Netherlands and Germany only. We all started our studies during COVID times, with lockdowns and restrictions being the norm, like they were for most of us. This has firmly shaped our lives over the past year and a half, and is why we thought it might be interesting to connect the outside reality of our study environment with the insights we gained from our studies. In the Philosophy of Science and Methodology course, we studied Immanuel Kant and his philosophy of science. Aaron, would you like to tell me a little bit about Kant, his life and values maybe?
Yeah, sure. So Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher during the Enlightenment era of the late 18th century. He was born in 1724 in Königsberg, East Prussia, which is now Kaliningrad in Russia. He studied at Königsberg University and went on to be a professor there until his death in 1804. Immanuel Kant is known for bridging the debate between rationalists and empiricists because he combined reason and senses as the ultimate sources of knowledge. Kant had a modest upbringing, with his father being a simple saddle maker. Both of his parents were deeply religious and very strict. Kant, however, did not have any religious beliefs, but he early on recognized the potential of religion to act as a moral compass. Kant saw great importance in ethical behavior, which can be seen in his formulation of the categorical imperative. As I mentioned, Kant lived during the period of Enlightenment, so many of Kant's theories are characterized by the growing secularism of the time, and he welcomed the declining belief in Christianity, but was also a pessimist of human character, as humans are always prone to corruption. These ideas led to his life's work, namely the desire to replace religious authority with the authority of reason and the need for ethical behavior in social communities.
Thanks so much, Aaron, for all of this information. But now that we know something about Kant in general, I'm wondering, how would you draw a connection between this philosopher's standpoint, whose working took place in the 18th century, and the pandemic the world is facing right now, because that's happening in the 21st century?
What Aaron just said reminded me of Kant's categorical imperative that I came across the other day. The categorical imperative states, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So this seems like a really complicated statement, but it actually is a restatement of the basic idea of many religions. Do upon others as you would have them do unto you. Meaning, this concept of morality helps us reflect on and see our own behavior without taking criticism too seriously. As we have the ones who hold our criticism too personally, as we are the ones who hold ourselves accountable. It is the voice of our own rational self which tells us to follow the restrictions implemented by the government. We are part of a bigger community where we look out for each other and protect the vulnerable.
This seems like a really idealistic concept, building a working society on the freedom where each individual has to hold themselves accountable. But how can we understand the categorical imperative in the political sphere, especially during COVID times? Because I get the feeling we are rather restricted through political institutions than we are free.
Yes, I understand where you're coming from. So initially, the government should enforce liberty. However, this does not mean that we can do whatever we want. This becomes very apparent during this crisis. People have different beliefs and measure by their own standards. Right here in Amsterdam, we have different ideologies. People who believe in the danger of the coronavirus and people who are corona deniers, protesting without masks at museums line. Kant, as a pessimist of human character, recognized this problem as well. That's why he specified that liberty is not the absence of a government, but helps us become more reasonable, hence the COVID restrictions. As he formulated it, the government should be a universally valid will under which everyone can be free. And that's how the circle closes and we come back to holding ourselves accountable.
I'm sure we've all been in situations in which we thought to ourselves that it must be all right to buy a few more products than we actually need, referring to the panic buying mentioned in the article that I introduced before. But to buy more than I need at the supermarket fails to pass the test of the categorical imperative, because it's not possible for everyone to buy more than they need, only for a small fraction of the population. However, if we all only buy what we need, then everyone can buy what they need. We think it might not make a big difference if it's just me breaking the restrictions, but if everyone does so, it has a lasting impact. I think the example of panic buying ties in brilliantly with the categorical imperative, as the voice of our own rational self tells us to follow the rules for a greater good.
Yes, Lydia, I agree. We've all debated with our rational self with corona regulations. But this makes me think about the idea of what rationality really is in the bigger picture of our current pandemic. From what I can remember in the presentation you held in class about Kant, you mentioned his idea about causality and how to really create rationality within our community, we need to find harmony between reason and observation. As we learned in the first week of class, empiricists state that sensual experience is the ultimate way of understanding concepts and knowledge. But Kant argues in favor of the combination with rationalism. We should also think about reason. That way, we could create a common understanding and a systematic knowledge on current real-world problems that we face through unifying people's experiences and reflecting power into a whole. One big aspect of Kant's work was to wrestle for the acknowledgement that synthetic a priori statements lead to knowledge.
Sorry, my synthetic what?
It sounds tricky, but basically it just means that these statements originate in our mind, not from the senses, and add to our knowledge in the end. Therefore, you combine concepts in your head that is not true by definition, which can lead to knowledge. This is also how much knowledge is attained during COVID times. Observation wasn't necessary to know how the virus spread, and the people came up with ways to avoid the spread, all in their heads. All things considered, I want to bring up an article I discovered about India's recent surge in COVID cases and how their data has brought up a topic of the death paradox, which showcases that observation can still be very necessary to gain knowledge. My rational mind has believed that corona surge leads to a higher death toll, yet this article brings up an anomaly to this idea. A good example of how my mind has made an analytic assumption is that I say this with a grain of salt, as the death paradox can be a controversial topic, but the article suggests that the low mortality rate in India might have more to do with demographics rather than the number of cases themselves.
Do you have some facts and figures on the demographics, Mai?
Yes, I do. The most recent census showed that 45% of the population was 19 years or younger, showing that India's population skews are younger than first world countries. And from what I understood, infections rates with old people were usually low, and that could be because those who survive to old age in India are often wealthier and were better able to socially distance themselves. As a result of both these factors, researchers suggest that India's older death bracket is significantly lower compared to other countries.
As the example suggests, observation can be beneficial to gain knowledge. But if knowledge is also possible from within our head, as Kant argues, how can we gain concrete knowledge if it's all seemingly invented by the mind?
Well, the mind does play a big role, but Kant and other philosophers like Hume argue it are our senses that give us the initial impressions of the world. Here it is important to note that Kant believed there to be two worlds, the nominal world and the phenomenal world. The nominal world is the world of objects themselves, which cannot be seen, however. The phenomenal world is the world as it appears to us, meaning as we perceive it with our senses. As we can only perceive the phenomenal world, this is the world which we can gain knowledge about. We do this by combining our rational mind with our senses. Human reason enables us to attempt to make sense of the nominal world as it appears to us, thereby creating universal and necessary knowledge about the phenomenal world. This is the transcendental idealism May talked about earlier. This reason that allows us to explore the nominal world also liberates us from the natural laws governing the phenomenal world, meaning it allows us to act freely. This freedom obtained through reason simultaneously establishes it as our moral compass. However, not everyone accepts Kant's ideas. For example, skeptics. They question many things, like the attainment of knowledge from science and observation. They deny that science brings us knowledge, but rather believe knowledge comes from subjective experience. They argue the reliance on reason is dangerous, as it can lead to pseudoscientific knowledge, like May's example on the death paradox highlighted. Moreover, pseudoscience can fuel anti-COVID followers to believe that COVID is a political hoax. Gottlob Ernst Schulze, a critic of Kant, says there is no objective knowledge but singular subjective experiences, which is why people swear on pseudoscience and believe what they read. Like mentioned, I think this is why many people do not believe in COVID in the first place. For example, also me, in the beginning, I did not personally know someone who had contracted the virus, but reason and trust in science allowed me to recognize the dangers of the illness. From students to politicians, many smart people have fallen for dangerous lies spread about the new coronavirus. Why? Is an article highlighting Kelly Brogan, who received a medical degree from Cornell University, yet has questioned germ theory and the existence of COVID. Also, Nicole Carroll wrote an article titled, "Why do people deny the seriousness of COVID-19? She came to the conclusion that the people base their beliefs on false information, social media rumors, or the fact that they don't personally know anyone who has had COVID-19. This shows we need reason in order to differentiate between science and pseudoscience. Our senses alone are not enough, as they only gain an impression of the nominal world, but we need to understand the universal laws of the phenomenal world to draw conclusions about our world and reality as a whole, or otherwise we run the risk of being stuck in a self-affirming bubble, skeptic towards science."
The journey we took today portrayed again what this crisis presented us with: uncertain times. What are politicians allowed to do in a democratic system? Can they restrict our human rights in order to protect the greater good? Or should they trust in the categorical imperative within us? We're all asked to work as a collective, because only then we can embank the COVID crisis. However, after over a year in a pandemic, the tiredness of isolation and governments going back and forth with restrictions is understandable. But thank you guys so much for all the effort and preparations you put into this podcast. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in and expanding your horizon regarding philosophy and its constant debate between empiricism and rationalism. Immanuel Kant is a brilliant example of a philosopher who bridged these two approaches on how humankind can gain knowledge. As we learned today, even though Kant's philosophy was composed in the 18th century, his ideas can be put into relation with current themes regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, such as panic buying, the COVID surge in India, and skepticism towards science. Kant called upon us to act morally in the 18th century, and modern leaders globally do so too. I wish you all a beautiful day and hope to have you back for next week's podcast, which will be all about Wittgenstein and his idea of language games within contemporary themes. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.